On September the 17th, 2018, we will mark a fairly positive 40-year or 40th anniversary of a major peace accord, or rather major peace accords in the Middle East. And you guessed it, the Camp David Accords, brokered by US President Jimmy Carter and signed by him, the Egyptian President Mr. Anwar el-Sadat, and the Israeli Prime Minister Mr. Menachem Begin. These accords entailed the recognition, diplomatic recognition, of Israel as an independent country rather than just as a the so-called Zionist entity by Egypt, and Egypt became the first Arab country to diplomatically and officially recognize Israel as an independent country. There was to be a 5-year transitional period of self-government in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank territories. However, it wasn't until 1994 when both territories became so autonomous that they established their own administrations. And now, of course, we know that many countries have recognized Palestine as an independent country. Israel, of course, does not include, is not included in those countries, and so forth. And then Israel agreed to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula, which it had occupied since the 6 Days War in 1967, and the withdrawal was complete by 1982. According to the late British Jewish historian Sir Martin Gilbert in his History of Israel, published in 1997, it was, at least for the first some or several years, a so-called cold peace. There were some cultural exchanges between Israel and Egypt, but the relations remained rather cool. Ironically, however, Israel, or the Israeli democratically elected or appointed leaders, learned how to negotiate quite well with the authoritarian Egyptian president Hosni Mubarak during his 29-year rule that then ended in early 2011 as a part of the so-called Arab Spring revolts. None of the three leaders were able to benefit politically a lot, although Sadat and Begin shared the Nobel Peace Prize in December 1978. Sadat was, according to a Finnish lay preacher who has specialized since the 1970s in the interpretation of end-time prophecies, I will not mention his name to be polite, was denounced as a dog and a traitor to the Arab front. Accordingly, Egypt was excluded from the Arab League from 1979 all the way until 1989. And as we know, Jimmy Carter, because of his numerous domestic and foreign policy failures, despite this success, lost by a landslide the November 1980 US presidential elections to his Republican challenger, former California Governor Ronald Reagan, and accordingly had to leave office in January 1981. Sadat was gunned down fatally by a few radical Islamic terrorists who had infiltrated the Egyptian army during the so-called victory parade of the Yom Kippur War in October 1981. And then Menachem Begin came under accusations of tolerating the so-called Sabra and Shatila massacre in southern Lebanon in 1982. Besides, during the autumn of that year, his beloved wife died. He became deeply depressed and left office in October 1983. And then the March 1979 Egypt-Israel peace treaty confirmed these accords. The time that has elapsed since the Camp David Accords has left no doubt as to their enormous ramifications on Middle Eastern politics. Most notably, the perception of Egypt within the Arab world changed. With the most powerful of the Arab militaries and a history of leadership in the Arab world under the late dictatorial president Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt had more leverage than any of the other Arab states to advance Arab interests. And as I said, Egypt was suspended from the Arab League from 1979 to 1989. Jordan's King Hussein saw the Camp David Accords as a slap to the face when Sadat volunteered Jordan's participation in deciding how functional autonomy in the West Bank region would work. More specifically, Sadat effectively said that Jordan would have a role in how the West Bank would be administered. Like the Rabat Summit resolution, the Camp David Accords circumscribed Jordan's objective to reassert its control over the West Bank. Focusing as it did on Egypt, the Carter administration accepted Sadat's claim that he could deliver to Hussein. However, with Arab world opposition building against Sadat, Jordan could not risk accepting the accords without the support from powerful Arab neighbors like Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Syria. In other words, or accordingly, Hussein felt diplomatically snubbed. One of President Carter's regrets was allowing Sadat to claim that he could speak for Hussein if Jordan refused to join the talks, but by then the damage was done to the Jordanians. The Camp David Accords also prompted the disintegration of a united Arab front in opposition to Israel. Because of the vague language concerning the implementation of Resolution 242 that had called for Israeli withdrawal from the territories occupied, especially the West Bank territories occupied during the 6 Days War in June 1967, and the resolution was passed by the United Nations Security Council shortly after that war. The Palestinian problem became the primary issue in the Arab-Israeli conflict immediately following the Camp David Accords and arguably until today. Lastly, the biggest consequence of all may be in the psychology of the participants of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The success of Begin, Sadat, and Carter at Camp David demonstrated to other Arab states and entities that negotiations with Israel were possible, that progress results only from sustained efforts at communication and cooperation. Despite the disappointing conclusion of the 1993 Oslo Accords between the PLO and Israel, and once again, one of the signatories paid a high price. He was assassinated over 2 years later, in November 1995. You guessed it, he was the Israeli Prime Minister, Mr. Yitzhak Rabin, while the PLO chairman Yasser Arafat only died in November 2004. And even though the 1994 Israel-Jordan peace treaty has not fully normalized relations with Israel, both of these significant developments had little chance of occurring without the precedent set by Camp David. Most Israelis supported the Camp David peace accords. However, the Israeli settler movement opposed them because Sadat would not agree to a treaty in which Israel had any presence in the Sinai Peninsula at all, and Israel had to withdraw from the entire Sinai Peninsula. Israeli settlers then tried to prevent the government from dismantling their settlements. In 2001, a poll taken by the Jaffe Center for Strategic Studies based in Israel found that 85% of Israelis supported the Camp David peace accords. However, a minority of Israelis believed the price Israel paid for the peace agreement was too high for its present gains. In essence, having relinquished the entire Sinai Peninsula with its oil, tourism, and land resources, Israel has no other oil wells, and the trauma of evacuating thousands of its Israeli inhabitants, many resisted, as in the settlement of Yamit, and had to be forcefully evacuated, a phenomenon encountered also in the subsequent Israeli withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, known as the disengagement. For Israel, perhaps the most evident tangible benefit of the agreement with Egypt, other than the subsequent US aid, which Egypt also received, was a peaceful mutual border, enabling the Israeli Defense Forces to reduce their levels of alert on Israel's southwestern border. Although Egypt and Israel generally abided by the agreement since 1978, in the following years a common belief emerged in Israel that the peace with Egypt is a cold peace. Others feel that the peace agreement was between the Israeli people and Egypt's charismatic president, Anwar el-Sadat, rather than with the Egyptian people, who were not given the opportunity to accept or reject the agreement with a free vote or representative majority.